Hi, I'm Kelly Monaco. I'm currently unemployed, so I created this channel to earn some extra income. I'll be updating you with the latest news about the Drama General Hospital.
Hello and welcome back. We just received some shocking news about Jordan's accident and wanted to share it with you. The truth did not explode into Port Charles all at once. It arrived the way the most dangerous truths always did in this town, through fragments, half-heard suspicions, tightened expressions, and the quiet terror that spread across people who suddenly realized the story they had been telling themselves was beginning to crack. What first looked like a brutal act of reckless violence against Jordan was no longer being treated as an accident wrapped in confusion. The deeper the PCPD pushed into the wreckage, the more it became clear that this was not random, not impulsive, and certainly not simple. Someone had wanted Jordan's vehicle to fail at the worst possible moment, and once that possibility took hold, every relationship around the case began to shift under the weight of paranoia. What turned the investigation into something even more dangerous was not merely the possibility that sabotage had occurred, but the growing shadow around Isaiah, a man whose name should have represented healing, steadiness, and moral clarity, yet was now being dragged into a storm of suspicion so severe that even those who wanted to trust him could no longer do so without hesitation. At first, the case seemed to move in a dozen conflicting directions. There were too many people connected to Jordan, too many grudges, too many hidden motives buried beneath old loyalties and recent betrayals. But when investigators began looking more closely at the vehicle itself, the pattern changed. Damage that had initially been dismissed as the aftermath of impact began to suggest prior tampering. The possibility of brake interference or some other deliberate compromise turned the entire incident from tragedy into calculated intent. Once that happened, the question was no longer who had been nearby that night. The question became who had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the nerve to alter a machine and then step back, trusting chaos to do the rest. Isaiah's name emerged not because he fit the image of a violent saboteur, but because the facts around him had begun to align in ways that were impossible to ignore. He had moved through the edges of that night too quietly. He had answers ready too quickly in some moments, then became strangely evasive in others. Most unsettling of all, he carried himself with the controlled calm of a man fighting far harder to stay composed than anyone initially realized. That was what made the situation so unnerving. Isaiah did not behave like a monster. He behaved like a man under pressure, a man who understood consequences, a man trying to contain something before it spread. That distinction terrified people even more, because in Port Charles, the most dangerous acts were rarely committed by those who looked visibly guilty. They were committed by people who believed they had a reason, by people who convinced themselves that damage could be managed, that fallout could be contained, that one desperate choice could solve a larger problem. As the PCPD tightened its investigation, whispers began to take on sharper form. Isaiah had not merely been near the narrative, he was somehow inside it. The rumors changed from speculation about what he knew to darker questions about what he had done, what he had helped hide, and whether his connection to the sabotage was direct or part of some larger chain of obedience and fear. And then came the detail that complicated everything. Isaiah's alibi was strong, almost too strong. The timeline supporting his whereabouts was coherent, precise, and difficult to dismantle. There were signs that at the crucial window, he had been somewhere else, occupied in a way that appeared to remove him from the immediate act itself. Under ordinary circumstances, that should have relieved suspicion. Instead, it created a different kind of alarm. In criminal investigations, a persuasive alibi could clear a man, but in a case rooted in sabotage, it could also suggest planning. If the vehicle had been tampered with well before the crash, then the person responsible did not need to be present when the damage unfolded. Suddenly, Isaiah's convincing alibi did not erase him from the case. It only transformed the nature of his possible involvement. The question shifted from whether he caused the crash in real time to whether he had a role in setting the trap long before Jordan ever touched the wheel. That possibility hit with devastating force because it collided with Isaiah's identity. He was not supposed to stand on the side of destruction. He was supposed to represent intervention, care, repair. The growing suspicion that he may have adjusted or interfered with actions surrounding the car or helped guide someone else's sabotage created a moral collapse far more disturbing than a simple villain reveal. It suggested corruption from within, a fracture in someone whose goodness had once seemed like one of the few stable things left, yet even that interpretation was not clean. There were hints that Isaiah himself might not be acting alone, and that the pressure surrounding him extended upward toward the authority structure above him. The mention of his boss began to hover over the case with increasing menace. It was no longer enough to ask what Isaiah had done. The more urgent question became whether Isaiah had acted under instruction, coercion, blackmail, or some poisonous mixture of fear and loyalty. In that possibility lay the true horror of the story. A man might not need to be cruel by nature to become part of something cruel. He only needed to be trapped deeply enough to convince himself there was no way out. The PCPD understood that dynamic, and that was why their investigation became more relentless. They were no longer simply reconstructing a crash. They were probing a network of influence, a web of behavior that suggested sabotage might be tied to decisions made in private rooms long before Jordan's car spun out of control. Every interview became a pressure point. Every timeline was tested against another. Every gap in memory became suspect. Isaiah's name being confirmed as connected to the case did not mean the department had solved the crime, but it meant the story had entered its most dangerous phase. Once law enforcement had enough to say he was not incidental, Isaiah stopped being a witness near the edge of tragedy and became a man whose choices mattered to the structure of the crime itself. That alone was enough to turn his world inside out. He could no longer hide in ambiguity. He could no longer rely on the benefit of the doubt. In a town like Port Charles, once suspicion hardened into confirmation of involvement, even partial involvement, the tide of judgment became nearly impossible to reverse. What made Isaiah's position even more unbearable was the psychological strain of knowing that truth had layers, and each layer threatened someone different. If he confessed too much, he could destroy himself. If he confessed too little, he could allow a more dangerous figure to remain protected. If he stayed silent, he might preserve one loyalty only to betray a deeper moral obligation. The emotional terror of that balancing act began to show in subtler ways. The man who had once seemed grounded now felt internally divided, as if every word had to pass through fear before it could reach the surface. The obsession surrounding his actions began to consume not only the investigators but Isaiah himself. He started to look like a man haunted by calculation, replaying every decision, every contact, every moment when he might have stepped back and refused to cross a line. That kind of internal unraveling is what gives this story its force. It is not merely about whether Isaiah is guilty. It is about what guilt does to a man even before a court ever touches him. It is about the way conscience becomes its own prison once a person realizes that intention no longer matters as much as consequence. Jordan's suffering intensified everything. Her pain was not abstract. It was physical, immediate, and devastating, and that meant the investigation could never remain just an intellectual puzzle. Curtis's fury gave the story another pulse, another layer of emotional heat. For him, this was not a procedural mystery. This was an attack that shattered the fragile stability of people he loved. Every new indication that the crash may have been engineered sharpened his rage, and every mention of Isaiah's name threatened to twist that rage into something even more dangerous, because suspicion is easiest to endure when it targets a stranger. It becomes unbearable when it lands on someone who once seemed trustworthy. That is where the story becomes truly volatile. The possibility that Jordan's attacker has been found does not bring clean relief. It opens a deeper wound. If the answer leads to Isaiah even partially, then the fallout will not stop with arrest or accusation. It will spread through every bond, every alliance, every old promise that once held people together. The most chilling aspect of the case is that the truth may not be singular. Isaiah's compelling alibi suggests intelligence behind the sabotage. His confirmed connection suggests proximity to intent. His apparent coordination with his superiors suggests this may be part of something larger than personal malice. Those three realities do not cancel one another out. They build a far more disturbing picture, one in which Isaiah may not have stood alone over Jordan's car, yet may still have played a pivotal role in allowing the sabotage to happen, in shaping its timing, or in helping conceal the trail afterward. That ambiguity is precisely what makes the story feel so unstable. A clear villain would make the town angry. A morally compromised participant trapped under someone else's influence makes the town afraid, because it means corruption has become harder to identify and easier to justify. As pressure mounts, the relationship between Isaiah and his boss becomes the most explosive fault line in the narrative. If Isaiah was manipulated, then his silence may be fueled by terror rather than coldness. If he was persuaded that the sabotage would only frighten Jordan rather than endanger her life, then he may be living inside the horror of unintended consequences. If, on the other hand, he knew exactly how far this scheme could go and still cooperated, then his tragedy becomes darker, because it means he crossed the line fully aware that someone could die. In either version, his soul is no longer intact. That is the emotional center of this arc. It is not merely the investigation or the suspicion or even the possibility of an arrest. It is the destruction of self-image. Isaiah may have spent years believing he knew what kind of man he was. Now he is being forced to face the possibility that fear, pressure, and hidden ambition turned him into someone he would once have condemned. The investigation is therefore not only uncovering the saboteur, it is stripping illusions away from everyone involved. The PCPD wants facts, Curtis wants justice, Jordan's loved ones want answers. But Isaiah is trapped in a far more intimate battlefield. He wants a version of events that allows him to survive what he has done or fail to stop. That kind of survival rarely comes easily in General Hospital. Port Charles has always been a place where secrets buy time but never peace, where delayed truth only grows sharper by the time it surfaces. Isaiah's convincing alibi may buy him space, but it cannot give him innocence. His connection to the sabotage may be explained, but explanation will not erase damage. And if the real mastermind above him begins to panic, Isaiah could quickly shift from compromised participant to expendable liability. That is why the story feels like it is approaching a breaking point. The alleged attacker may have been found, but discovery does not mean closure. It means the masks are starting to slip. It means a man once seen as compassionate may soon be exposed as a shattered instrument in a larger design. It means the official investigation is about to collide with private guilt, buried fear, and the terrible price of choices made in the shadows. If Isaiah finally speaks, he could bring the entire structure down. If he refuses, he may drown with it. Either way, Port Charles is heading toward one of those brutal revelations that leaves no one untouched, because the real shock is no longer just who targeted Jordan. The real shock is how many lives were already rotting beneath the surface before the car ever lost control.
I'll be back at the General Hospital soon. We'll see each other again soon. Thank you for supporting my channel. Goodbye and see you again.